If you run a homebrew 5th edition game, Van Richten's Guide to Ravenloft might be the best book that Wizards of the Coast has ever released for you. This video is sponsored by Describe, more on them later. So I've spent the last couple of days reading through Van Richten's Guide, and like every other D&D YouTuber, I was planning on releasing a review or a first impression video talking about everything in the book, talking about the horror elements and the Ravenloft setting and kind of reviewing the book in its own right. But then I started reading it and I realized that this is actually an excellent book to pick up as a world builder, as someone that makes homebrew games, and it actually includes a huge amount of Dungeon Master advice that should have been in the Dungeon Master's Guide. So for those that are interested in whether I think you should buy this book, right up front, if you run a homebrew game and you're interested in creating worlds and creating unique stories outside of pre-written modules, this book is going to have something for you, even if you're not running a horror game. If you are running a horror game, then absolutely pick up this book because it's packed with really useful information for running specifically horror games. But even outside of that genre, there's a lot in this book for adventure creation, for creating a campaign, for building unique and interesting villains, and for being a dungeon master. I'm also going to be giving away a D&D Beyond copy of Van Richten's Guide to Ravenloft. To be in with a chance of winning that, you just need to leave a comment down below, and then once this video gets to 1,000 likes, I'm going to be choosing someone that's commented down below and they will win that copy. So make sure to like the video, comment down below to be in with your chance for winning. So I want to dive in and talk about some of the specific elements of this book that really stood out to me as being a worthwhile purchase, regardless of whether you want to run horror. So here we are in the Creating a Dark Lord section, and this is the first section that I want to talk about because I think it is one of the best parts of the book. The book presents a series of disparate planes, the domains of dread, that the players can navigate through, each of which has its own unique spin, its own take of horror, and its own Dark Lord. But it gives you a whole suite of tools for creating a Dark Lord, which I think are actually excellent tools for just creating any kind of villain. So you can see under the Creating a Dark Lord section, you get a whole bunch of information. You get the section titled Sinister Reflections, which talks about how a good villain, and not just a horror villain, but any villain, should be a reflection of the protagonists of the story. So in our case, the player characters. We want to reflect certain elements of those player characters in the villains to make those villains more memorable, to make our players connect with them more deeply. And this extends well beyond horror and is just really good story writing advice that can apply to any genre. So the book gives a couple of examples here. We get exaggerated reflections. For each flavoured personal characteristic, imagine and write down a version twisted to its extreme. For example, transform I idolise a particular hero of my faith and constantly refer to that person's deeds and example, into I'm obsessed with the hero of my faith and I must become exactly like them so that I can take their place. And it says the more unreasonable the better. Now this is just great advice regardless of the kind of villain that you're creating. If you can mine your players' backstories and their ideals and bonds and their personality traits especially, if you can take those personality traits and make twisted versions for your villain, the players are going to connect with them much more deeply. There's a section on their past life. It says, Dark Lords aren't mindless killing machines, which is true of all good villains. They're full but monstrous individuals. So they deserve as much attention as a player is going to give to their character. You want to give them personality traits, again, that are those twisted reflections of the player character's personality traits, but you want to think about who were their family, where did they grow up, what was their childhood like, what specific nuanced things led them on the path to ultimately become a villain. And it recommends that you consult the DMG or the This Is Your Life section from Xanathar's to give you even more inspiration. But I think a lot of what it asks here is really fundamental to a character. So who hurt them? Who did they respect or love? These are all great questions for a villain. Then we get a section on their personality and we get some ideas on what their ideals, bonds, flaws could be, and then what are some of their fatal flaws? What are some of the key parts of their personality? Like, I'm always right and anyone who doesn't agree with me is cut out of my life. If that was who they were as a person before becoming a villain, that's only going to make them more villainous because they don't have anyone to question them left around them. And then there's a section about being corrupt beyond redemption. Now this specifically does relate to the Dark Lords in the Domains of Dread, but if you want to run a villain that is irredeemable, this is what you want to think about. You want to think about what evil acts have they committed that means that they can't come back from the place they've ended up in. And then this is one of my favorite sections, the developing a Dark Lord section. It prompts you to ask really detailed questions about your villain that are going to really help fill in some of those gaps. So what was the first depraved act the Dark Lord chose to commit, and how did that ideal encourage them down this path? Excellent question. Thinking about these background elements of your villain, understanding how they end up where they are now. Another really great question, did the future Dark Lord realize that they were losing any hope of redemption, yet choose to commit other heinous acts in keeping with their flaw? These are all really detailed things to think about with a villain, and they're going to result in such a nuanced villain, much better than just throwing a stat block in front of the players. And then the next section that I think is really useful, no matter what genre you're playing or what setting you're making, is to creating a domain entry. Now this has a whole bunch of stuff relating to making a world that fits the characters and fits the villain, and taking that approach in your homebrew world building is going to make much more intimate settings for your players and their characters, because you are reflecting those parts of the character's backstory, but you're also heightening those elements that you've created for your villain. So in the Ravenloft setting, all of the Domains of Dread are a reflection of their Dark Lords, and you can take this idea into your own homebrew setting and create a world that is a reflection of the central antagonist, or reinforces elements of a really important character within the setting, and tells your player characters something about the world itself, but also about the characters around them. So there's a section in here about culture as well, which is really useful when you are making homebrew. There's questions like, what does your culture fear? What does the culture consider taboo? What is scarce? Who or what does the culture inflict harm upon? These are all excellent questions, regardless of whether you're making a Domain of Dread culture or just any culture for your homebrew settings. And then again, it's got a section on monsters. It asks, what monsters live in your region? So if we're making a homebrew world and not just a Domain of Dread, what monsters are your people that live there most likely to come across? And all of these questions really help to build a much more interesting and in-depth homebrew world. Another thing that I really liked about the Ravenloft book is the section on making heroes, on character creation. Because a lot of it comes from the point of view that you're going to be playing horror, there's a lot of time devoted to getting the players all on the same page, which I think is really important no matter what game you're playing. And it says, you know, all the players have to agree to this social contract where you're all agreeing to be scared in the case of horror. And that is really important for creating the atmosphere that you will go on and play in. And this kind of thought process holds true no matter what genre you're going to be playing in. If you're going to be playing a high adventure setting, you want the players to buy in to those high adventure concepts. You want the players to care about the treasure, to care about rescuing the prince or the princess. You want them to care about these big ideas that are core to the genre. So no matter what setting or genre you're playing in, getting that buy-in from the players is really important. And the book takes this even further in the 4th chapter, where it talks about kind of setting expectations, having a session 0. All of this is really useful information for a first-time Dungeon Master that isn't really touched on in the Dungeon Master's Guide. The Dungeon Master's Guide has a lot of tables, it has a lot of rules and mechanics, but it's really lacking on kind of the broad, high-level stuff that you need to know as a Dungeon Master. What does it mean to be a Dungeon Master, and how should you approach some of these meta elements? That's kind of missing in a lot of the DMG, and this fills in a lot of those gaps. Like with the session 0, it gives you kind of a checklist of things that you want to cover in your session 0, reinforcing expectations, establishing boundaries, customizing your experience, discussing genre. All of these things are really important, and I'm really glad to see that they've been included in this book and I think they're really useful even if you're not running horror. Another thing I really like about this book is the random tables. I think they're really evocative, which is something that I think this book does really, really well, is even if you're not interested in the setting of Ravenloft, even if you're not interested in running a horror-themed adventure, there is a lot of world building in this book that is really, really evocative. So there is a list of horror trinkets, things that your characters might come across and have on their person in these horror-themed settings. But they are really, really interesting. So we've got a teacup from a child's tea set stained with blood. That's super cool. That fits the horror vibe really well, but it's also really, really cool. Clothes stolen from a scarecrow, a set of silverware used by a king for his last meal. All of these things in the random tables presented throughout the book, they're all really, really evocative and stir the imagination, which is what I want from a book like this as a Dungeon Master. I want to open it up, and even if I have no plans on running anything in the official settings or using any of the content presented exactly how it is, I want to be inspired. One of my favourite parts of the whole book, though, is the curses section. Curses are something that I really enjoy using, and because my homebrew setting, Ashk, is a desert, there's a lot of tombs to be uncovered and a lot of curses and a lot of curse potential to kind of throw at my players, so this section really excited me. It breaks down curses into multiple stages. There's the pronouncement, what happens, something that warns your players, here's what's going to happen vaguely if you break this curse. The burden, which is the curse itself, and then the resolution, which is how do you remove this curse from yourself. The ancient seal, which is the first example curse, is really iconic in terms of its place in fantasy literature. You have the pronouncement, which is carved into the stone of the crypt door, the words "relentless death follow those who disturb the sovereign's rest." And then the burden is any character that gains this curse has a wraith appear at sunset that vanishes at dawn, and they try and kill the character. That is super cool because it's a delayed reaction, and I love it when these consequences are delayed so the players don't immediately realize what they've done wrong. So they get these wraiths come up, they have to fight them off. The daylight comes or they defeat the wraith and they think they're safe. And then either the next day or in 10 days' time, if they've defeated the wraith, they come back, and they will keep coming back until the players realize what they've done and resolve the matter, either by returning the treasure or returning the body they've taken from the tomb. This kind of stuff is super evocative and super useful no matter what kind of campaign you're running. Before we talk about my favourite part of this new book, let's hear from today's sponsor, Describe. If you've been following the channel for a while now, you'll know that I'm a big fan of anything that reduces your mental overhead as a DM, which is why I'm really pleased that today's video is sponsored by Describe. Describe has thousands of pre-written description boxes like the ones you'd find in a published adventure to help you bring your world to life for your players. Do you need to describe the creepy castle your players are heading towards? Describe has got your back. Want to give your fireball spell a bit more pizzazz? Load up the Describe entry. Or if you want to describe some monsters, pull up the entry on Describe and get a custom description that you can use to excite or terrify your players. Many of the description boxes on Describe have been written or edited by Wizards of the Coast alumni, and they're all designed to fit in with the established 5th edition style. Describe has hundreds of text boxes available for free, but you can unlock thousands more with a monthly subscription. You can even tailor your subscription depending on what kind of things that you want to describe, or you can choose an option that gives you access to everything. And if you use the code Icarus at checkout, you're going to get 10% off your first order, which will effectively give you a free month if you're picking up an annual subscription. Check out Describe using the link below, and thanks again to them for helping to support the channel. Now, to show you why I think that this book is such a great and useful tool as a homebrew dungeon master, I want to jump into the domains of dread. The book presents a variety of domains for you to use in your games, and while they've only got a couple pages devoted to them each, I genuinely think that you could expand a near full campaign out of each of these because of the way the information is presented to you. And I want to kind of run through one of these as an example to show you what I think is so effective about it. And to do this, we're going to be using the domain of Harakir. Now, this is the domain of the ancient dead. It is a dark fantasy sort of pseudo-Egyptian inspired desert setting, so obviously I'm really interested in it. It is very similar to the kind of games that I'm already running, but I think it is a great example to use to show you what this book is doing for a homebrew dungeon master, how it is presenting information and what you can glean from this. So right up top we have Harakir, the name of your campaign setting. Then we have a tagline. I think taglines are so useful as a homebrew dungeon master to give that sense of here is what you're buying into. The domain of the ancient dead. That says something to your players about what they should expect in this campaign setting. And then we have a section for our Dark Lord, Anctopot. We have our genre, which is dark fantasy. This could be any genre that you wanted. And then Hallmarks. This is a really useful tool as a homebrew dungeon master. So for Harakir, it's ancient tombs, desert perils, lost gods, and mummies. This is going to be really useful for you to replicate in your own homebrew games. So write out what the hallmarks of your setting are. If you have a setting inspired by a real world place or time, then you want to take some of those elements and incorporate them as hallmarks. It's going to give you a strong sense as a narrator of what kind of elements you want to focus on. Then we get our introduction to the setting, which gives us a little bit of history, lays out what is interesting about the setting and a little bit of its background, and then we get notable features. Those familiar with Harakir are going to know the following facts. It's a land of vast deserts and deadly storms. Water is scarce beyond the land's few oases and the city of Muhar. The land is ruled by the Pharaoh, the immortal intermediary between the mortals and the gods. He rules from his pyramid, Pharaoh's Rest, in the city of the dead. So in 2 bullet points, we've got a huge amount of information. We've got that it's vast deserts, we've got deadly storms, which allows us to incorporate some of those weather elements. When the party are traveling, we can incorporate those storms. We know that water is scarce beyond the oasis, which gives us points of conflict. If the players are away from an oasis, water is going to be more valuable than gold, and it will probably come up in the bartering system in those areas. We know that the land is ruled by Anctopot, who is an immortal. That's an immediate piece of information that we get. He serves as an intermediary between mortals and gods, and he rules from his pyramid, Pharaoh's Rest, in the city of the dead. The city of the dead, great name for a city, really evocative, and Pharaoh's Rest tells us something about the history. We can imagine that this is probably a place where successive pharaohs have been laid to rest. There's probably a long history there. 2 paragraphs or bullet points, and we already have huge amounts of information about this place from a broad conceptual level. This is how you want to be structuring your homebrew campaign. This is going to help you so much when it comes to making your own world by starting off with these really broad concepts. Then we've got a section that describes what life is going to be like for an Icarian character. And this is another thing that I think is really useful and would benefit any homebrew dungeon master from pulling from, because you get this notion of how your character fits into the world. How do you survive the desert realm? What role does music play in your life? Because in this particular setting, music is a big deal. How do the gods feature in your life? These kinds of questions are really good to ask the players to think about their characters, to make characters that are more in tune with the setting that you're making. And then we come to probably my favorite part about this book, is that all of the major domains get a map, and each of these maps has got enough information, I think, to sustain an entire campaign. So if we blow this up here, make it a little bit bigger, so you can see this is Harakir, the sands of Soot. We can see that there's a load of detail here. There's the Breath of the Forgotten and the Breath of the False, 2 great sandstorms that go across this desert land. There's the different oasis. There's the white and red oasis, the Muhar oasis, and Sex Tears. All of these things are potential locations our players could go to, and then we have a whole bunch of other interesting locations. So Pharaoh's Rest, Huseb Kha's tomb. All of these are places the players could go to and we could have adventures in, but we don't have to think of them right off the bat. We could take this map and make a whole campaign setting around it, even excluding the mists and all the Ravenloft connection. Just making this a desert in your land would be really interesting. And then we come to the principal figure in this setting, Anktopot, who is a ancient immortal pharaoh who longs to be able to die. That is super evocative for a motivation for a villain. This villain doesn't want riches, they don't want immortality, they've got immortality. They want to find the missing piece of their soul, their car, and they want to return it to themselves so that they can become mortal and they can die. That's a really interesting premise for a villain, and it gives you loads of information and loads of ideas for how that could come into play. So if we go, we have role-playing for our villain, and then we also have adventure ideas, all the information is for the gods, and then an entire section for that central premise, that recovering of Anktopot's car. We have options for the form that it could take, so a hawk or a giant eagle that tirelessly circles the sun, or a set of relics holy to the old gods of Harakir. These are all really interesting things that you could use to give yourself variety. And then you also have the hunter's role. So once you know the form of the card, determine how the characters become involved with the hunt for it, and it gives you ideas on that. All of these things set you up that you could run an entire campaign off these few pages of notes because of how well presented all the information is. And I think that's, for me, the biggest benefit of this book is the way that it lays out everything and the way that it sets up these locations, and all of the kind of behind the screen stuff is really inspiring for a dungeon master. I know I'm looking forward to diving into all of these domains and learning everything about them and gleaning all the inspiration I can from them to incorporate into my own home games. Let me know down in the comments below if you're going to be picking this book up, if you're inspired to dive through it for your own homebrew game, and don't forget I'll be giving away a D&D Beyond copy to someone who has commented below once the video reaches 1,000 likes. But until next time, happy gaming.